President Biden, tear down these walls. The walls the Palestinian people are still trapped behind. The Western world, and especially the United States, have the power to pressure Israel to stop its crimes in the occupied Palestinian territories, but instead they are supporting them. They promised never again, and yet here we are, watching Israel implement its final solution in Gaza, as Biden urgently requests $14 billion in military aid for Israel. And the US State Department discourages diplomats from publicly using the terms de-escalation, ceasefire, end to violence or bloodshed, and restoring calm. I've been devastated, though not surprised, by the way that Western countries and Western media have reacted to this conflict. The general sentiment seems to be that Israel has the right to defend itself, no matter what, no matter how much collateral damage it takes. But anyone who has followed this conflict for more than a few weeks should understand that it didn't start on the 7th of October. Hamas didn't start this war. This war started long before Hamas was even founded. I think that ultimately your opinion on the situation boils down to whether you believe that Palestinians deserve the same human rights as the Israeli, and whether you think that Palestinian lives have the same value as Israeli lives. Palestinians have never had full autonomy, but they have also never had full civil rights in Israel. At the bottom of it, the support many Western countries have given to Israel shows that Palestinians are not seen as equal human beings. I don't know how many of the people who claim that Hamas started this war and that Hamas is responsible for all the harm caused to Palestinian civilians are ignorant, and how many are intentionally misleading. At least the representatives of the Israeli government, such as the Israeli ambassador in the UK, definitely know that they are lying.
So, as you know, Israel is now in the 10th day of this war that Hamas started.
What's the view on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza this morning?
There is no humanitarian crisis because
there isn't.
There is no.
We have been showing images this morning that illustrate that there is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
So blame Hamas and ask Hamas why they started those atrocities, walking around.
So you acknowledge that there is a humanitarian crisis?
I'm saying there is no. Israel is working.
So what do you think is happening?
What is happening? There is a war in Gaza, a war that Hamas started.
To understand the full picture, we need to talk about the situation in the occupied West Bank. One important fact that the media and the Western leaders seem to disregard is that Hamas is not in power in the West Bank. In fact, the Palestinian Authority, which is responsible for the governance of the West Bank, for the parts that are not fully controlled by the Israeli military, is led by the secular Social Democratic Party Fatah, which for a long time now has tried to find peaceful solutions and has been very compliant with Israel. So why is the West Bank not free? It's not because of Hamas. So what is the justification for Israel to continue the occupation and to refuse to give full autonomy to the West Bank? Why should we trust Israel when it says that if only Hamas gave up its arms, Gaza would be free? Non-violence clearly hasn't brought Palestinians freedom, but instead the situation has just become worse. And that has made Palestinians grow tired of Fatah and PLO.
يعني المخيم جنين يعني بروحش علينا الا مثلا نقول شهداء اسرى يعني حياتنا كلها شهداء اسرى يعني فيش حياه حلوه عندنا يعني بوجود الاحتلال والسلطه فيش لنا حياه يعني
عيني يعني لما استشهد نضال الله يرحمه يعني اول ما فات الجيش على المخيم ولا قوات سلطه ظلت المخيم كلياته.
Israel has continuously built new Jewish settlements in the West Bank, evicted Palestinians from their homes they have lived in for decades, and allowed settlers to move into those houses, and created apartheid policies which give a lot more rights to the Israeli settlers than the Palestinians who live in the same areas. When people have no basic human liberties and no hope, can you really be surprised when some of them get radicalized?
احنا نقاوم الاحتلال مستحيل إسرائيل تعمل حل ثاني غير المقاومة، إنه حل سياسي أو إنه في هدنة أو سلام. مستحيل. هسه لو تجيبي كل السلام اللي بالعالم تحطيه بدولة إسرائيل راح تلاقيهم ثاني يوم بيعملوا مستوطنات، ثاني يوم بقتلوا، ثاني يوم بيأسروا. يعني هم بيأسروا نسوان وبنات صغار وشباب صغار أشبال. وإحنا بنطلب من الشعب كله يكون ضد إسرائيل مش بس السلطة.
He says his dream is to see Palestine free so he can lead a regular life.
أعيش حياتي الطبيعية وبطش وبروح على البحر وبعمل كل اللي أنا نفسي فيه، كل اللي أنا بدي إياه. ده ولا طبيعة فلسطين بتجنن يعني، وأنا من الناس اللي بحب أروح واجي على الطبيعة، على الجبال وعلى البحر.
When you push people in a corner, treat them as subhuman, deprive them of their basic needs, raid their homes, and randomly attack them, do you think that will make them resist less? The best way to reduce public support for extremism is to give Palestinians the same rights and liberties that Israelis have.
What we want is to not be treated as second-class citizens. We want our full rights under a fully just system. I live in Nabi Saleh, which is 30 minutes away from Jaffa and Tel Aviv, and I can see the Mediterranean Sea from the rooftop of my house, but I've never been there because I'm a Palestinian.
Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank are considered illegal under international law, but the current Israeli government doesn't only allow them, but actively pushes to expand them by building thousands of new homes for settlers in the occupied territories. This is one of the ways Netanyahu's government tries to jeopardize any possibility of a two-state solution.
Violence in the West Bank has escalated in recent months as Israel's government has pushed to expand settlements. The United States and the United Nations have recently condemned the building of thousands of new Israeli homes on occupied territory.
Settlers have many rights in the West Bank that Palestinians don't have. For example, settlers have the right to bear arms and are even encouraged to do so by Israel, while Palestinians are not allowed to own guns.
We're in a firing range in a settlement in the West Bank, and these guys behind me are civilians training to do border security, and they've got some pretty mean-looking guns. I discovered that it was easy for a settler to get a gun license in the West Bank. All they had to do was qualify at a shooting range like this one. But Palestinians living in the same area are never packing because Israel doesn't allow it.
Israel's right-wing national security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who himself is a settler and was convicted of inciting racism and aiding terror organizations in 2008, has been handing out rifles to Israeli citizens, including settlers, many of whom are already armed in the first place.
Palestinians have no freedom of movement even within the Palestinian territories. There are walls, not simply around the West Bank, but mostly inside of it, that restrict the movement of Palestinians and their access to different parts of the territory.
Like all Palestinians, we live under Israeli reality, Israeli oppression. Here in the West Bank, in Bethlehem, we live under the Israeli military occupation, where we suffer from restrictions of movements, very limited opportunities economically. Overall, the quality of life here is very difficult. This used to be the main road in Bethlehem. And then the wall cut really in the middle of the road. And what used to be one of the liveliest streets or roads in Bethlehem is now this dead area as a result.
Palestinians have to pass multiple checkpoints, not only when crossing to Israel proper, but also when trying to move within the occupied West Bank, on their way to school or work. Meanwhile, the Israeli settlers can move around freely, using main roads that are forbidden from Palestinians.
We're here at the town of Bir Nabala, and as we're trying to go to Aram, as you can see, Israel has built a separation wall that blocked the road for Palestinians. And here there's an Israeli road that can only be used by Israelis. At the end of this road, there is the Qalandia checkpoint that is the main link between Ramallah and Jerusalem. We cannot go there. Only yellow-plated cars can go inside. Only Palestinians who have permits, and even if they have permits, they cannot drive their cars inside. They have to go in walking.
This is Fadl, who has lived in this home his whole life. In the 1980s, Israel set up this checkpoint in front of his house. Fadl now has to check in every time he leaves or enters his own home.
كيف بتضايقوا عليكم؟
زي ما انت شايفه بخلوش قرايبنا يجوا علينا.
خطرة.
يعني بنتي متجوزه، مين مسموح لها تيجي جوزها لا.
وهلا لما بتمرق ايش لازم تفرجيه؟
اسمه ورقم هويتي.
وانت بتقدر تمشي
لا.
هون مش ممنوع؟
بس لحديتهم.
واو.
هون ممنوع.
On that street over there, Palestinians are allowed to walk and open businesses, but not allowed to drive. The yellow street on the map is a street where Palestinians are only allowed to walk, not allowed to drive, and not allowed to open businesses. The streets that we're heading towards are mostly sterile, meaning that no Palestinian in the whole wide world can walk on those streets.
This is kind of a common sight here in the Old City. There's a Palestinian family that lives at the end of this alleyway. Above them is an Israeli settlement, and because the settlers throw garbage down at them, they have to put these nets here to protect them. So we're standing here and I'm talking to her in front of her home, and every time we hear a noise she looks up, and I asked her, are you afraid the settlers are throwing something down at you? And she said, yeah, لأنه بصير كتير إنه برموا عليكم.
كتير بصير. كمان إحنا ما بنقدرش يعني ننزل من مرة من هون 24 ساعة في الدار، يعني زي باعتبار السجن.
If this is not apartheid, what is it then?
We actually welded shut their doors. We send Israeli soldiers to weld shut those front doors of these families while everyone else who is not a Palestinian can walk freely.
This video shows what it takes for one Palestinian woman to leave her home. She climbs her roof and scales back down to the ground to exit on a back street where she is allowed to be.
People will say, yeah, but those walls and checkpoints and blockades are there for a reason. Israel has to defend itself from terrorists. No. You can't apply collective punishment to 3 million people in the West Bank and 2 million in Gaza just because there are some terrorists among them. Israel also systematically demolishes structures that are built with developmental aid in the West Bank. For example, EU-funded schools. Now, there have been claims that the reason why Palestine doesn't have working civilian infrastructures is because they use the funding they receive to build bombs or to buy guns. But how are you supposed to build a working infrastructure when your occupier destroys the building you receive funding for? Is this also Hamas's fault somehow? The EU has condemned the demolitions that are illegal under international law. And yet, here we see the President of the European Commission stand with Israel in the ethnic cleansing of Gaza.
And Israel has the right to defend itself. In fact, it has the duty to defend its people.
At least I'm relieved to know that there are some opposing voices in the European Parliament.
When the EU should have been arguing for a ceasefire, for the upholding of international law, for the protection of civilians, Ursula von der Leyen touches down in Tel Aviv to photo op the preparation of a genocide and says Europe stands with Israel now and in the days to come. How dare she? She has no authority in foreign affairs matter. She does not speak for me. She does not speak for Ireland, and she does not speak for the citizens of Europe. We stand for peace. We stand for justice for the people of Palestine and for the upholding of international law.
Apparently, Ireland is the only country in the EU that isn't completely spineless. Israel also demolishes Palestinian homes, as well as allows settlers to take them over and to throw the Palestinian residents on the street. The Israeli military protects settlers, and only settlers, in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. And the evictions are usually ruled legal by Israeli court.
Outside her home, Nora Sublaban shouts that criminals have evicted her and given it to settlers from abroad. Israeli soldiers cordoned off this narrow alleyway in Aqabat al-Khaladiyah in the heart of occupied East Jerusalem. They pushed their way into the Sublaban family's home and evicted them. People have gathered to support the family. The mother has lived here for nearly 7 decades.
I was born in this house. It holds all my beautiful memories before the death of my mother, my childhood with my mother.
The families say the landlord of this home is linked to a settler movement that wants to reshape the identity of the old city. They say they expelled her on the grounds that before her birth, the owner of the property was Jewish. That's legal under Israel's absentee property law.
Many of the settlers aren't even from Israel, but Zionists from abroad. for example from the US.
Many of Hebron's settlers moved here from the United States. Sadio came from Brooklyn a few years ago.
Does it bother you that you're living somewhere so heavily militarized where Palestinians that have been here for generations are getting kicked out of their houses and can't walk on certain streets?
So I'll ignore the use of the term Palestinian since there is no such nation or people. It doesn't bother me at all. Militarization is a thing happening all across the world. I'm not up to anything and nobody's invading my space for no reason. I don't care.
I was typical American in the 80s. Then I happened to see a Rabbi Kahana came to our campus, and he made me think that there's something else I can do with my life. Rabbi Kahana saw the problem, and he identified the problem, and he gave an answer. The answer for him was to expel the Arabs from Israel. After 2,000 years of living under the Gentiles, we said, thank you, but no thanks. We've come back to our country. So now we've come back, and we have a people inside us who can turn it into Palestine through democracy, through babies and not bullets. And who can protest that? It's democracy. So there's a big contradiction between democracy and Zionism, because Zionism says it's got to be a Jewish state no matter what. So when some youth go out and do something against an Arab, I can't say it's wrong. I can't blame them. So if my girls went out and did something like that, I'm not going to condemn them. I taught them that they should self-sacrifice for their people and for their country. So they're doing it, you know. I'm proud of it.
It shouldn't be about whose ancestors lived there 3,000 years ago. Where else in the world could that be used as a justification to steal people's houses? It's about people who live there now, who were born there, and whose families have lived there for generations. How can anyone think it's justified to expel those people from their family homes, to be replaced by settlers? There has also been a rising wave of violence towards Palestinians by settlers, who attack people, burn their houses and cars, and destroy other property.
The ambulance crew were lucky to escape without serious injury when settlers threw rocks at their vehicle last week. They were called out to treat Palestinians who'd been injured when settlers attacked a village in the occupied West Bank.
I didn't think we would make it out of there alive. We were driving between cars that were on fire, and I would never have expected that they would attack an ambulance.
There were an average of 17 settler attacks a week on Palestinians in 2022, a 170% increase in 5 years, according to the UN.
Before the 7th of October, there were on average 3 attacks towards Palestinians by settlers every day in 2023. This year has been the deadliest for Palestinians in the West Bank since UN data collection began in 2008, with almost 200 Palestinians being killed by Israeli forces or settlers before the 7th of October, at least 38 of them children and 5 of them under 12 years old. Settler violence rarely leads to convictions. Instead, the Israeli military protects them, but they don't protect Palestinians from these attacks.
مش بس أنت بتحكي عن جندي مدجج بالسلاح اللي هو بهددك، لا بتحكي عن المستوطن اللي بيشوفوه العالم الغربي أو الأجانب إنه مدني طبيعي زيه زي أي إنسان. المدني اللي بتحكوا عنه مدني هذا بينزل على الشارع وبصير يضرب بالأطفال، والمدني اللي أنتوا بتشوفوه مدني بيكون مصرح له يمسك سلاح بأي وقت ويطخ على الفلسطيني وما يتحاسب.
Why doesn't Western media call settler violence what it really is? Terrorism. Far-right fascist terrorism, supported by the Israeli government.
I've been working in the field of human rights here in Israel and Palestine for about 23 years. Settlers are a very varied group. Some of them are not violent at all, although they often nevertheless turn a blind eye when others are being violent. And some of them are very violent. The most violent perhaps are the so-called hilltop youth.
شفت نار مولعة دخن كثيرة ونار قوية. لما شفت قلت والله هاي دار بنت. هسا أنا توجهت لنا ناحية البيت. كان في البيت موجود اللي هو كان موجود علي، كان موجود سعد، كان موجود ريهام، وكان موجود أحمد. علي كان عمره 18 شهر. كان مشعل أحمد كان متخبي وراه كنباية على أساس إنهم ما يشوفوا المستوطنين لأنه شاف إنهم اعتدوا على أمه واعتدوا على أبوه شافهم بعينيه.
My daughter Rani got married. The one who made the shidduch, he was one of the fellows from Duma. So we had a lot of hilltop youth. In the middle of the wedding, some hilltop kids, they took like a sign, and it happened to be one of the babies that were burned in Duma. And I don't cry for Duma. I don't cry for what happened.
אני אישית, לי לא מפריע שתינוק ערבי פתאום מת לו. כאילו זה לא יותר מפריע לי שיהודים מתים פה. כאילו ערבים לא כל כך מעניינים אותי, הם חיים, הם מתים. אני מעדיפה אותם מתים.
هذاك اليوم أنا طلعت على التلفزيون شفت العرس عرس الحق تبعهم هذا وهم يحملوا صورة علي صورة طفل 18 شهر ويعملوا له بالسكين. بالنسبة لأحمد ممنوع بالنسبة إلي أنا أعيط ممنوع أبكي كنت أطلع برا وأبكي. طب أنا لما شفت هذا المنظر صرت أبكي على علي وعلى أرهام وعلى سعد إنه تطلع هاي العالم مستوطنين عاملين عرس كمان يعني بتفاخروا وبتباهوا إنه إيش قتلنا طفل 18 شهر.
A Palestinian youth convicting of throwing stones can get a longer sentence than an Israeli convicted of murdering a Palestinian.
Also, before the 7th of October, there were already over 1,000 Palestinians imprisoned by Israel without charges or trial, in a so-called administrative detention, and several hundred Palestinian children are detained and prosecuted in Israeli military courts every year. Gaza, then again, is governed by Hamas, and Israel removed its troops and settlers from there in 2005. But since then, Gaza has been under full blockade from land, air and sea. So in practice, Gaza is still occupied by Israel. Israel controls everything that goes in and out of the area. This makes it difficult for Gaza to build any infrastructure that is in its own control, since Israel heavily restricts dual-use import materials. That means materials Israel considers to be possible to use for anything else than their intended purpose, which includes a lot of construction materials. For example, Palestinian water infrastructure is almost entirely under Israel's control, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, which is why Israel is able to cut water as well as electricity, fuel and food from the area.
With a water crisis, international donors and governments have stepped in. Today we've been invited to the inauguration of Gaza's new desalination plant, which will take salt water from the sea and convert it into water that's safe to drink and wash in. But access to the Gaza Strip is not easy. The Israeli blockade means projects such as this are beset by delays and difficulties, mainly because it's almost impossible to import dual-use materials into Gaza, materials that the Israelis say could be used for military purposes. This plant is opening 7 years behind schedule.
For the time of the blockade, it hasn't been out of goodwill that Israel has provided Gaza with water and electricity, despite some claims of that being the case. It's because, as the occupying power that controls the area, they are obligated to do so under international law. You can't hold Hamas, nor the Palestinian Authority, responsible for the safety of Palestinians if you control everything they are allowed to do, and you don't give them any true autonomy or freedom. When you make it impossible for the PA and Hamas to take care of the safety and to build necessary infrastructure, they are your responsibility. People also say that Gazans have voted Hamas as their leader. Well, you need to understand that almost half of Gazans are children. The last elections were in 2006, when 70% of current Gazans weren't either born or old enough to vote. So you can't really say that Gazans have had the chance to democratically elect their leaders. These people were born in the prison camp. They've never experienced anything but oppression and threat from Israel. If you treat people like human animals, as the Israeli defense minister called them, how can you expect them to learn anything but to hate you? So, while the leaders of Hamas live in safety and prosperity in Qatar, the militants on the ground most likely don't see any other hope or any other way out of the situation than to join those terrorist groups. This isn't a justification, but it is an explanation, and we have to understand the causes of this violence if we want to end it in the long run.
What makes you so certain that joining Hamas, joining the Al-Qassam Brigade, and ultimately turning to violence is the answer here?
There's no other solutions but this weapon.
Abu Khalid is 25 years old. He's one of thousands who joined Hamas as a teenager and has been active in the group ever since.
The fact that you're down here in tunnels that have been built under civilian areas, you're launching rockets from civilian areas as well, doesn't that mean that you're endangering Palestinians that you claim to be fighting for?
We are sacrificing ourselves and our times and everything we do in order to ensure a better future for our children.
But are you also not sacrificing the civilians that are directly above you?
Of course, we don't want them to get killed or to get targeted, but this is the only choice we have. This is what we can do, and they are supporting us. You can go to the sea, you can go to the air, you can go to anywhere. So that's why we are building tunnels. This is the only mean which is possible for Al-Qassam brigades.
If you want to end this terrorism, you have to give people another solution. Everyone who expresses pro-Palestinian views is asked whether they condemn Hamas, but hardly anyone is asked whether they condemn the occupation, the blockade, the settlements and the settler violence, whether they condemn Israel's clear and continuous violations of international law. The UN Secretary General accurately reminded that the attacks of Hamas didn't happen in a vacuum, speaking nothing but the truth. But Israelis were furious, calling him to resign and saying that they'll stop issuing visas to UN officials. This shows the arrogance and entitlement Israel feels when they expect the world to grant them impunity in their genocidal actions. It shows that the Netanyahu government doesn't see Palestinians as humans who deserve human rights. There are more dead children in Gaza right now than the total number of civilians Hamas killed, and yet we are expected to just accept them as collateral damage or necessary evil. So do I condemn Hamas? Of course I do. Killing civilians and taking them hostages is absolutely awful and a war crime and should never be condoned. However, war is not the solution. It hasn't been the solution to the situation before, and it won't be the solution in the future either. I also want to say that the brave Israelis who have publicly spoken against this war, some of them survivors of the Hamas attack and friends and family of the victims, have my utmost respect. Even in their darkest moments, they have more humanity and courage than the Western leaders could ever have. As long as Palestinians don't either have their own state or full citizenship and civil rights in Israel, militant groups, no matter how extreme, will get more support. If you're able to see Palestinians as actual human beings, you should understand that the only way to end this conflict is either by giving Palestinians their own state or by giving them full citizenship of Israel. Western leaders need to take the clear stance against Israel's crimes against humanity. President Biden, President von der Leyen, President Macron, Prime Minister Sunak, you are all responsible for this bloodshed. You have to stop funding and supporting this war. Otherwise, I hope the Palestinian children's blood you have on your hands will never stop haunting you.